I'm gonna snip it anyway, so it's okay. Uh, almost. Okay, and let's see. We are screen sharing and we are recording. So, no, cool. This is good. And then we'll do this. Okay, cool. Right over here. Okay, cool. So, yeah, we're recording and we are screen sharing and chunk. Cool. You ready to learn about the thing?
Yes.
Okay. Just listen, okay? Just listen and just hang out, and then if you want to say anything at the end, I'll let you know, okay? Okay. So these are the events that led to the American Revolution. The first sparks of the American Revolution came from the end of the French and Indian War, the Seven Years' War, which was in 1763. It was ended by the signing of the Treaty of Paris. So after this, Britain was left in massive debt. And to recover from this debt, they put taxes on the colonies to bring in revenue to repay their war debts. They started doing this by passing the Stamp Act in 1765. In the Stamp Act, what it did was they wanted to generate revenue from taxing the the paper goods and the deeds, the documents that the colonists needed. So for um, legal documents, legal written documents like deeds and wills, they needed to have a stamp placed on them, and the British put a tax on these stamps that the colonists had to pay in order to get them processed. They also put these taxes on written material, which were newspapers, playing cards, and even dice. So the Quartering Act was also passed in 1765, and the Quartering Act, what it had asked of the colonists was to provide British troops with housing, whether that be in inns, abandoned buildings, or houses of. So yeah, they needed to house the British troops, and that was out of they paid for that as well. So any revenue lost or gained from that, they that was towards the British Parliament. Um, and of course, things from the Stamp Act, the colonists did not like that. Of course, it raised tensions. It started colonists kind of questioning why they had such um, why they couldn't kind of govern themselves, why they had such a big tie to the British government still, even though they were their own colony states. Um, and with kind of how things were playing out with the Stamp Acts, the Townshend Acts were passed in June of 1767. And this was kind of to enforce the collection of taxes and a certain kind of a Britain's authority over the colonies. Just, hey, we need to generate these revenues and we're going to do whatever we need to do to get that from you guys. Um, and part of these were the Suspending Act, which stopped the New York Assembly from furthering any business until the requirements of the Quartering Act were followed. A lot of troops were still unable, or the colonists were still just causing a fuss over Quartering Act. So the Suspending Act stopped the assembly from continuing business were more uh, until they followed Quartering Act. And then there was also a Revenue Act that was passed, and it placed taxes on goods such as lead, glass, paper, paint, and also tea. And so with all these new taxes, there was still, I mean, there was an increasing sense of tension, an increasing sense of almost a hatred towards the British Parliament and government over what they were doing to the colonists. The colonists still felt like they needed more independence. They were in their own states and their own um, they were governing themselves pretty much. Why did they need Britain to play a big hand in what they were doing and where the revenue was going? So yeah, things were still just kind of continuing to boil, continuing to spike. All these angry feelings, all these violent reactions, and that leads into the Tea Act. Most of the taxes on goods from the Townshend Acts were actually repealed. The only exception was the tea. And in 1773, the Tea Act is passed, and it really helps. It supports the British East India Tea Company. It pretty much it took away a lot of the duties they had to pay on importing their tea in order for them to outcompete the tea that was making its way into the colonies smuggled in from the Dutch. Um, so yeah, the British East India Tea Company, they pretty much were the only ones importing to the colonies, which the British taxed. So the British were getting the most out of their taxes from the entire monopoly of tea, pretty much being taken over and run by their own company. So, following the passing of the Tea Act, a radical group led by Samuel Adams, the Sons of Liberty, they dumped 432 chests of tea into Boston Harbor. As they did so, they were dressed as Indians. They ransacked over. It was three ships, and they dumped all the tea into the harbor. This became known as the Boston Tea Party. Um, and so not only was all that product lost and the taxes on that product, but there were members of British Parliament that were large shareholders in the East India Company. So this caused them to be pretty irritated with the colonists, just furthering that disconnect, that separation of loyalty to Britain, pretty much. The coercive acts were passed in 1774, and this was kind of in a response to these actions. They were kind of just showing a little bit of discipline or disciplining the colonies. So in direct reaction to the Boston Tea Party, the Boston Harbor was closed until all the losses from the Boston Tea Party were repaid to them. This was in the Boston Port Act. And also the colony had an elected council that was completely replaced by British officials. And it was also now made mandatory to seek approval before holding a town meeting. Um, and then any British officials that were in the colonies, they were given immunity to, they were prosecuted. They weren't prosecuted in the colonies. They were to be taken to Britain to be prosecuted there. So they went by their own, they had immunity towards prosecution in the colonies. So with Britain playing more of a role in trying to take over the government or how things were run in the colonies, the consul or like the appointed people from the colonies, um, they kind of banded together. They wanted all of the colonies to come together and talk about their representation, and I mean, they're almost uh, distrust of the British Parliament. They didn't want any of their influence in the colonies anymore. So every colony was represented in this meeting, besides Georgia. And after discussion, the Congress rejected their taxation with that representation, the absence of the British um, government from taking over what was being taxed and how much taxes were going towards the British Parliament. And they also rejected the idea of the British Army occupying the colonies without the colonies' consent. The colonies did not want the British troops there. And why should they be there if they're being taxed without representation? And the colonies never consented to being occupied. So from there, after this, the The British kind of had enough of this radical movement, and they sent forces led by General Thomas Gage, and they were to march from Boston, march up to Lexington, and they were going to capture Sam Adams, which was involved in the Boston Tea Party, and also John Hancock, some of the radical leaders. Um, and after the capture of these leaders, they were to take their troops and march to seize all of the gunpowder held by the radical militiamen. They were to take this gunpowder. It was like a store or like a yeah, like a cache, a store of gunpowder that they held in Concord. Um, so they did have some intel on this, and they had Paul Revere that was helping the radical movement, and he warned of the British approach by riding from Charleston to Lexington. From on that path, he warned of their approach either by land or by sea by lighting lanterns on top of the North Church in Boston, Old North Church in Boston. And he were to light one if they were coming by land and light two lanterns if they were coming by sea. Because of his warning, the militiamen were able to confront the British troops in Lexington. There were 77 colonial militiamen that met the British troops, and gunfire was exchanged by both sides. But there stands that no one knows who fired the first shot, or so they say. The militiamen suffered minor losses while while they had reinforcements come in, and they stopped the British troops that were on retreat. They stopped them in Concord, and as the assault continued, the British forces were they had to completely retreat to Boston. They suffered heavy losses. It was 170 British troops that were killed and 26 that were missing in action. Um, so this kind of showed Britain that the Americans weren't just gonna let them do whatever they wanted. They did have a force to oppose the British troops, British government, and that they were ready and willing to fight for their freedom. So they were kind of seen as a really starting their push for revolution in these two battles. And so while all this was going on in Boston and the North, all these bigger events in the South, there were this it still wasn't sure if the South was going to join the North in in this revolution. But the in late 1775, the two towns on the coast were attacked by British Navy ships, with Falmouth and Norfolk. So they were bombarded by British naval vessels, and the towns were burned in the process. So Washington, being from Virginia, reacted to these two attacks and called them barbaric, exceedingly barbaric. Um, and and in addition to these two attacks, which I mean were already enough to incite um, some Southerners to start joining the North in its cause, the British also began telling slaves that they would offer them their freedom if they joined in the fighting with the British loyalists. So yeah, a slave would be able to gain their freedom by supporting the British. And of course, the number of slaves held in the South made this a pretty big threat. So with these two things, the South really started to share the feelings of the North, and starting a revolution against the British and fighting for their independence. So yeah, after these two things, attacks on the South and threats against the South, the colonies joined together against the common enemy and the British government. They sought their freedom, their independence, and they wanted their own form of government to continue this country that they were starting. So this fight for independence and the American Revolution then it began. Yeah, these are my works cited, and thank you for your time.